Most people imagine death as something peaceful, maybe drifting away in a soft bed, surrounded by family, with a final breath that feels like release. But not everyone gets that ending. Some die in very dark places. Ivan the Terrible did. He didn't pass in silence. He collapsed inside the Kremlin, choking on fear, clutching relics, swearing he saw demons waiting to drag him into hell. His final moments weren't calm. They were a nightmare, played out in the shadows. And that's where the intrigue begins. Think about it. The most powerful man in Russia, the man who executed thousands, ended up begging saints painted on icons to protect him from visions only he could see. No golden light, no comfort, just paranoia, regret, and screams echoing in chambers lit by flickering candles. It's the kind of death that makes you wonder what really waits for us when our minds are heavy with guilt. Lean in, lower voice. And here's the truth nobody wants to admit. Ivan's ending feels extreme, but it's not completely foreign. Because darkness isn't just a room, it's a state of mind. How many people die haunted by mistakes, by silence, by the things they never said? Ivan's story is just the most brutal version of a truth we all fear. That the place you die might not be peaceful at all. It might be the darkest corner of your own soul.
Ivan didn't grow up like most kids. His world was one where love was rationed like scraps of bread, but violence was served daily. Imagine being a child, learning not to trust a smile because it might hide betrayal. That was his reality. And yet, in the middle of that chaos, he clung to one belief, that God himself had chosen him. It was his lifeline, but also the seed of something darker, something soaked in intrigue. Think about it. It's like growing up in a house where your parents never said, "I love you," but made sure you watched them fight every night. You don't learn to trust people, you learn to survive. And survival often warps into ambition. Ivan's ambition wasn't painted with peace. It was painted with faith sharpened into a weapon. A faith that told him he was destined to rule through wrath. And here's the twist. Trauma doesn't always announce itself with screams. Sometimes it whispers. Maybe you've seen it yourself. The quiet kid at school who flinches when a teacher raises their voice. Or the coworker who works themselves to exhaustion. Because deep down, they're terrified of being abandoned. Trauma leaves a mark. And Ivan's mark turned him into a boy who prayed with one hand and plotted with the other. And from that boy would rise a ruler who'd invent a system built not on trust, but on fear. A system dripping with intrigue. He was staging a performance, a theater of terror. His black-clad horsemen, the Oprishniki, rode through the streets like specters. They dressed in dark robes, mounted black horses, and carried severed dog heads on their saddles. They claimed the dogs were there to sniff out traitors, but really, they were props in a play designed to make everyone tremble. Imagine seeing that outside your window at night. The sound of hooves echoing, torches flickering, skulls swinging from saddlebags. You wouldn't just feel fear, you'd feel cursed. And that's the brilliance of Ivan's cruelty. It wasn't chaos, it was choreography. Every detail, every symbol, designed to burn terror into memory. They didn't just execute people. They made executions into spectacles. Nobles impaled in the square, their families forced to watch.
Villages burned to ash while the oprichniki paraded through chanting prayers twisted into threats. It's like he invented a secret police mixed with a religious cult. Not just law, not just soldiers, but something in between. Something people couldn't fight because they couldn't even name it. Think about it. When power wears the mask of religion, people lose the courage to resist. To question the state feels like questioning God himself. And Ivan blurred those lines perfectly. The church bells that once marked holy days now echoed over fields soaked in blood. This is the part that makes the story so full of intrigue. Fear wasn't just a tool, it was a language, and Ivan spoke it fluently. But here's the danger. Fear spreads. It doesn't stay in its cage. And once Ivan unleashed it, even he couldn't control it forever. Because the same fear he used to break his enemies would soon turn inward and start breaking him.
At first, Ivan's theater of fear worked exactly as he intended. Villages trembled at the sound of hooves. Nobles bowed deeper, their smiles stretched and forced, terrified of being accused of treason. For a while, Ivan believed he was untouchable. But fear has a strange way of seeping back into the one who spreads it. When you live surrounded by suspicion, you start inhaling it yourself. And Ivan began to suffocate. He started seeing enemies everywhere. Every corridor of the Kremlin felt darker. Every conversation a whisper plotting his downfall. His once glittering court no longer felt like power. It felt like a prison lined with shadows. Imagine a man checking every lock in his house. Not once, not twice, but over and over, until the act itself becomes his only sense of safety. Now stretch that image to the scale of an empire. That was Ivan's paranoia. An empire, locked and relocked, every day, yet never secure. He demanded priests bless his meals, his robes, even his bed sheets. Not out of faith, but out of raw fear. And still, he was restless. He confessed constantly, not as repentance, but as bargaining. One day begging God for forgiveness, the next demanding that traitors be tortured in his name. His prayers weren't peaceful whispers. They were frantic, hysterical, desperate chants echoing off candlelit walls. The cycle was endless. The more he prayed, the louder his fears became. The more he punished, the more ghosts seemed to surround him. And the court noticed. They whispered that the Tsar no longer slept, that he wandered the halls in the dead of night, talking to skulls of men he'd executed, that his laughter would suddenly break into screams, that he stopped fearing assassins and started fearing damnation itself. This is what paranoia does. It magnifies silence into footsteps, shadows into assassins, and guilt into demons. Ivan the Terrible, the most powerful man in Russia, now lived like a prisoner in his own palace. His grip on the throne remained firm, but his grip on reality was slipping. And that unraveling would soon erupt into the act that defined his madness forever, when his wrath fell upon his own bloodline.
Picture a chamber in the Kremlin, its walls covered with heavy red drapery, the air thick with the smoke of oil lamps. The night is cold, and the flickering light throws long twitching shadows on the stone floor. Ivan the Terrible paces like a caged animal, his beard unkempt, his eyes bloodshot, his staff clutched tight in his hand. Across from him, his son Ivan Ivanovich, a proud young man dressed in fine robes, his voice firm, refusing to bend before his father's paranoia. Words are exchanged, sharp, heated, unforgiving. The clash isn't just between father and son, it's between past and future. the old lion suspicious and violent, and the heir bold and unafraid to confront him. And then, it happens. In a flash of fury, the Tsar raises his staff. The polished wood gleams under the lamplight for a single breath, before it crashes down on his son's skull. The thud echoes like thunder, followed by a sickening crack. Silence grips the chamber. Servants freeze. Even the lamps seem to flicker lower, as though the room itself recoiled in horror. The young man staggers. His eyes, once full of fire, roll back as blood trickles down his temple. He collapses into his father's arms, limp, gasping for air. Ivan the Terrible, suddenly no longer a ruler but a father, drops to his knees. He presses his hands over the wound, desperate to stop the bleeding, his cries tearing through the night. "My son! My son! Forgive me!" The crimson spreads across the heir's robes, staining them darker and darker. Ivan rocks back and forth, clutching the dying body, tears mingling with blood. Those who witnessed it later said his wails echoed down the corridors like the howls of a beast, not the roar of a czar, but the broken sobs of a man who had destroyed his own flesh and blood. Imagine the sight, the mighty autocrat of Russia, the man who commanded executions, who painted entire towns in fire, now kneeling in a pool of blood, powerless, shattered. His face streaked with tears, his lips moving in frantic prayers that no angel would dare carry to heaven. From that night onward, Russia itself seemed darker. The people whispered that the murder was no accident. It was punishment from God. They said even the shadows of the Kremlin held the memory of that crime. And Ivan himself would never escape the image of his son's lifeless eyes. Because once you kill your own legacy, every mirror, every shadow, every prayer becomes a reminder. And Ivan would carry that ghost forever.
After the death of his son, the Kremlin turned into a mausoleum. Every corridor whispered, every shadow lengthened. The walls themselves seemed to breathe with accusation. Ivan's footsteps echoed louder than ever before, not because the palace was empty, but because his mind was. At night, he was not alone. Witnesses spoke of him roaming the dark halls, holding icons in trembling hands, pressing them against his chest until his skin turned red. Yet when he closed his eyes, he didn't see saints. He saw his son's face, pale, bloodied, lips parted in that final gasping breath. That image replayed in his mind like a broken record, again and again, until prayer itself felt like punishment. He confessed constantly, but not out of peace. His confessions were frantic, desperate bargains shouted at the heavens. Candles burned down to stubs while Ivan clutched at priests, shaking them, demanding they speak louder, faster, until his guilt drowned under chants. But it never did. The silence that followed always returned heavier, like a stone pressing against his chest. And the nightmares. Oh, the nightmares. He saw himself drowning in rivers of blood, clawing at invisible hands, his son always standing at the shore, silent, watching. Sometimes he awoke screaming so loud the guards outside dropped their weapons. Other times, he laughed, a laughter so hollow that even his loyal oprichniki refused to enter his chambers until daylight. Paranoia, once his weapon, now became his curse. He believed demons walked beside him, invisible but real, whispering in his ears, pulling him deeper into madness. He would talk to skulls of his victims, caress them as though they were old friends, then hurl them against the wall in sudden fits of rage. The palace reeked of incense, but also of fear, as though the very air was poisoned by his guilt. Ivan was still the Tsar, still powerful, still feared.
But power couldn't silence ghosts. And every night, when the lamps dimmed and the court went quiet, his empire of fear became a cage of his own making. And in that cage, he sought strange ways to cleanse his soul. Rituals where prayer and cruelty merged, where torture itself became his religion.
Daylight did not bring peace to Ivan. It only offered him a stage. What began as executions to secure power turned into something far darker: ceremonies. He demanded that punishments be carried out with processions, chants, and symbols, as though each drop of blood was incense rising to heaven. To outsiders, it looked like madness. To Ivan, it looked like redemption. Witnesses described the Opnichniki parading through the streets, dressed in black, carrying severed dog heads mounted on spears. Behind them, prisoners were dragged, bound and broken, forced to march towards squares that had been transformed into makeshift cathedrals of terror. Ivan would sit high above, on a throne carved with orthodox icons, as if presiding over a grotesque liturgy. He prayed as men were impaled. He crossed himself as women screamed. The rhythm of the executions was deliberate, ritualistic, as though suffering itself was a hymn. To him, each act was cleansing, each victim a sacrifice that purified his sins. It was as if confession had become theater. But the stage ran not on forgiveness, but on screams. For those who lived under him, this was more than cruelty. It was psychological warfare. Ordinary people woke to bells that once called them to prayer, only to realize they were now tolling for another execution. And in that blurred line between faith and fear, Ivan's world revealed its darkest truth. Salvation and damnation could be forced upon you with the swing of an axe. And yet, even amid this ritualized horror, Ivan's body was betraying him. Strange symptoms, violent tremors, sudden fits of rage followed by crushing exhaustion. The medicine he believed would preserve him was poisoning him. And as his cruelty grew more elaborate, so did the rot inside his own flesh. By the final years of his reign, Ivan was a man consumed not just by paranoia, but by sickness that gnawed at his body like worms in a coffin. He shook with sudden tremors, his skin blistered, his mind wandered in hallucinations that blurred prayer with nightmare. At the time, no one questioned the treatment, because to question medicine was to question divine will. And so, physicians brought him what they called a cure, a bitter tonic, heavy with mercury. They promised it would balance his humors, purify his blood. Instead, it corroded him from within. Every symptom matched what we now recognize as mercury poisoning. The violent mood swings, the weakness, the failing memory, the tremors in his hands. Imagine a chess master whose fingers could no longer steady the pieces, a tyrant who could barely hold the scepter that once terrified an empire. He was rotting, yet convinced the elixir was holy. That was the tragedy. Not just that the cure failed, but that the cure itself was the poison. And so, in March of 1584, Ivan the Terrible sat before a chessboard. The board had always been his battlefield in miniature: strategy, control, the art of outmaneuvering enemies. But on that day, his mind faltered. His heart, already weakened by years of poison disguised as medicine, gave way. He collapsed forward, face striking the board, pieces scattering like soldiers fleeing a doomed army. In that moment, the master of intrigue, terror, and ritual died, surrounded not by armies, but by silence. There was no divine cleansing, no heavenly cure, only the irony of a man destroyed by the very ignorance he trusted. A czar who had built a life on fear, undone by a bottle of mercury dressed up as medicine. And in the end, it wasn't rebellion, nor assassination, nor even betrayal that claimed him. It was the flaw of his own age, a failure of knowledge, a blind faith in remedies that healed nothing and left only decay.
Ivan the Terrible's death wasn't an accident of fate. It was the echo of his life. Violent, paranoid, theatrical, and dripping with irony. A ruler who believed himself chosen by God, yet poisoned slowly by the very medicine he clung to like scripture. Mercury was his chalice, and ignorance the priest that handed it to him. His reign left Russia scarred, not just in the villages burned by the oprichniki or the families torn apart by paranoia, but in the way fear became the language of power. His death reflected that same language. A man trembling under the weight of demons, his mind fracturing, his body collapsing in the middle of a game that once symbolized his control. And so history sealed him in legend, not just as a tyrant, but as a spectacle. A ruler undone not by dagger or sword, but by alchemy disguised as healing. It was fitting, almost too fitting, that a man who turned violence into ritual should meet his end through the rituals of failed science. His legacy is a mirror, cracked, distorted, but impossible to ignore. The kind of story that still grips us centuries later because it carries within it the eternal intrigue of power, madness, and the frailty of human certainty.
That's the end of this video. Would you like to see more of it? I hope so. Let me know in the comments.